welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We are digging into part two of our focus on intensifying reading instruction, reading intervention within a tiered model. And we'll start by acknowledging the land that we are gathering on. We do acknowledge that ONLit's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. And we are thankful to be able to work on this land, and we are thankful to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people for their care for and teachings about the earth. This acknowledgement reminds us of our responsibilities to our relationships and to the ancestral lands on which we learn, work, and live. My name is Una Malcolm. I am the Chief Academic Officer of Dyslexia Canada and the project lead for ONLit, and I am thrilled to be joined by Ines Bijl, who is a special education consultant at the Waterloo Region District School Board. And we're so thrilled to be able to join you this evening and to dig into this really important topic. In terms of our plan for this evening, we'll spend just a few moments reviewing the taxonomy of intensification. If you joined us last time, you'll know that that's the framework that we're going to be using to guide our time together across this series. So we'll give a brief review of that, and then we'll focus in on two key areas: strength and dosage, ways we can push that button and provide more intense instruction for students who have additional needs. Then we'll pass it over to Ines, and she's going to dig into what this looks like in practice and actually model some instructional routines and some error correction, which I will be her student, and I hope I can I hope I can keep up. And we'll close with some space for some questions to unpack anything that has popped up. Just in terms of a brief disclaimer for our time together today, we will have a couple of slides that showcase some instructional materials. We just want to be very upfront and very clear that no examples that we present today are an endorsement of any particular instructional resource, simply a demonstrative resource that we can use as we highlight what this might look like in terms of maximizing opportunities to respond in practice for students. So just if you see any instructional materials, those are just simply examples and by all means not endorsements. So you will remember that we really are framing out this opportunity for us to intensify instruction for students who need additional support through particular areas that we can use to amp up the intensity. And this is something where we are operating within a tiered model. You will know that our Ontario language curriculum, the 2023 curriculum, highlights sort of the power of that tiered model to serve as a proactive, preventative opportunity to prevent reading failure and to provide that support for students in a timely manner. And then within this, we know that model, that tiered model, what distinguishes tier 2 and tier 3 supports from our core instruction is that intensity, how long, how often that intervention is delivered. We know this from the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Right to Read inquiry. So we do have this chart, which it's available on the site. Thanks, MJ. And we do also, I believe, have it, or we very will soon have it available in French as well. The NCII has kindly allowed us to adapt it to French for our French language colleagues. But we can think about this taxonomy as different levers we can press or different buttons we can press to intensify instruction, to make it more intense for students who have additional needs. And tonight, while we focused on alignment last week, tonight's focus will very much be on the strength of intervention and the dosage. We'll spend a few moments unpacking strength and then a lot of time digging into dosage together and really what that looks like in terms of maximizing opportunities to respond in multiple different ways. But before we get to that, I would like to just spend a couple moments clarifying what I mean when I'm digging into that concept of the strength of an intervention. And in terms of a definition, the National Center on Intensive Intervention really highlights that strength is our evidence of effectiveness. So this is something where we're able to understand, is this instructional approach, is this instructional material that we're using with students, do we have evidence to support its effectiveness in working with students who are needing that additional support? Now, While this might seem like a bit of a given that we would always be using evidence-based instructional materials and intervention resources with students who have those needs, we know from the Right to Read report that unfortunately that's not always the case. The OHRC really framed out that many of the commonly used interventions across the boards that participated in the inquiry, many of them were not. There was limited or no evidence of effectiveness for any tier of instruction. So while we would really want to ensure that all of our instructional materials do have evidence demonstrating its effectiveness, it's not necessarily a given. And this is unfortunate, especially when we think about students who need intervention, who need additional support. You'll see here, I've sort of outlined a little bit of a metaphor, this idea that the greater the need, the stronger the evidence is required. So if we were to be building, I'm no builder, but if I were to build a garden shed, there might be different requirements, different bylaws, different levels of levels of strictness in terms of the particular materials and processes and requirements for building a garden shed in a backyard versus to build a bridge that has huge public safety connections, right? This idea that with there being additional need, there being a higher bar for the type of evidence and support that would be necessary. And this holds true for our students who need reading literacy intervention. Students with additional need the most evidence-based approaches we know. They can't afford to waste instructional time with approaches that might not necessarily be evidence-based. Now, sometimes I get asked the question, well, what about making our own? What about developing our own intervention lessons? And again, we have that same element there where that starts to get challenging when we think about students who have the most significant needs. These are our most vulnerable readers who need the strongest possible support and response from us as their adults. So creating instructional resources or intervention resources, while well-intentioned, is likely not the best choice, recognizing we need materials that we have demonstrated evidence of their impact and their effectiveness. Now, when I say effectiveness, what does that mean? How are we determining effectiveness? And that's something where there can be a lot of pieces that can go into that idea of what makes something effective. And sometimes some of those ideas, some of that rationale might be leading us astray. So, for example, we might be thinking something is effective because it's well liked by educators. Maybe students are engaged during, use of this material. It may have worked for other similar students or, aligning with someone's perspective on literacy intervention. Or unfortunately, there might be a very persuasive sales rep highlighting that it is a truly wonderful resource, right? So it is sometimes, there can be different perspectives on what makes this intervention or this material a good choice. And while, some of these pieces might be at play, I would contend that we really are looking for a very specific type of evidence to help us make that decision on, is this a material or a resource that we want to be using with, again, some of our most vulnerable readers. So you'll see here Dr. Reed-Lyon highlighting that just with the importance of supporting students with those foundational reading skills, it's of critical importance. When we think of this, it is something that belief systems don't cut it, evidence cuts it. We need evidence of effectiveness for us to be confident that we are responding to students' reading needs with the best possible instructional response. Now, what counts as evidence, right? What type of research? How do we understand if something is effective? That's well beyond what we could accomplish in our time together. That might be something where there's a lot to go into that. But just at a high level, when we're thinking about what type of how we can understand if something is an evidence-based intervention material, we want to look to research, and we want to look to a very specific kind of research. Tim Shanahan calls it what works research, research that directly tests a particular instructional approach, a particular resource, a particular program, right? We're directly digging into that exact instructional material or approach where students are taught with that approach. We see this happening with students within schools, and we're seeing multiple groups where we're able to compare what happens for students who receive this type of instruction compared to students who didn't or received a different kind of instruction. And the reason we need to be able to do this is so the only meaningful difference between those groups is that instruction. We're able to really carefully isolate how do students respond to that instruction, controlling for as many other possible variables as we can. And it's this type of research design that lets us understand and lets us respond with a pretty good degree of confidence that, if we're seeing gains for students, if those students who received that instruction made stronger gains than other students, we can feel more confident that it is because of that intervention that they received. Now, this type of evidence, this type of what works research, doesn't always tend to be necessarily available for some reading interventions. So this is a completely made up intervention. Synapti-Read 360, to the best of my knowledge, is not a real intervention. And I certainly did not talk to the principal of Clear Skies Elementary, but I did make up this an example just to highlight that some of the marketing materials connected to reading intervention and reading instructional materials can be problematic and can be trying to highlight benefits and gains without necessarily having that strong evidence of effectiveness. So you'll see here we've got a bar graph showing pre-test and post-test, so gains within some sort of skill. Words read sounds a bit vague, right? We're not clear on what measures were used or, what that looks like, how many words were read, what represents sort of how does that compare to peers or to standard scores? And you'll see that, a glowing testimonial. The challenge with these types of case studies is we can't actually understand the effectiveness of this instructional resource. We don't have good information on how these data were measured, what the measurement was, and we don't have a comparison group to show, sure, there were gains. Was that stronger gains than would have happened with a different resource or a different type of intervention? So just to highlight this element that we really are looking for a specific kind of evidence so we can feel confident that we're responding with good instruction that is designed to support students in developing those foundational skills. So with strength in place, I would like to transition to that idea of dosage being an additional way we can intensify instruction for students who have additional supports needs. And when we think of dosage, we're really thinking about within that instruction, how many opportunities does that student have to respond and then to receive feedback from their educator. And this is a concept where there can be a lot of pieces that can feed into dosage. So a lot of things can impact dosage, particularly things like group size, right? In terms of how many students are in the group. We might expect that a reduction in the number of students in the group might lead to additional opportunities for students to respond and to amp up that dosage. Similarly, we could look to the number of instructional minutes or the number of sessions that a student has per week. All three of these elements could increase the dosage and increase the intensity. However, these three things are often really, really challenging to adjust. And in many systems, it might not be feasible at all to adjust them, right? In contexts where many, many students are needing additional support, there may not be wiggle room in schools and boards with a lot of intervention needs to be able to decrease group size or to make it where students have additional instructional minutes or can be seen multiple times per week, more times per week. So a factor that can really be supportive of increasing the dosage of an intervention actually is an easily changeable factor, and that's really looking at the explicitness of instruction that we're providing for students. And with that, I will pivot over to Ines to really dig into this because she's going to highlight what this looks like in practice.
All right. So thank you, Una, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. So we are going to be talking about intensification in practice when it comes to in our instruction. So first, we're going to dig into what are opportunities to respond. So opportunities to respond are guided by instructional techniques, questions or prompts by the teacher, sometimes gestures and cues to prompt students to engage and respond to something, a question or a prompt. We set up a task and then we engage students in responding. It's most common during the we do and you do phase of instruction. And then our brisk pacing really allows for our maximum reps. So when we think about the instructional techniques involved, we talk about questions, we talk about prompts, we talk about gestures. And these are all techniques that we need to think about that will allow for minimal teacher talk and maximum student talk, right? So I do something, I want it to be minimal, then you do something, I want it to be a practice opportunity. So that is what opportunities to respond are. When we think about why opportunities to respond are important, first of all, when we think about our structure of our lessons and why we want to structure them this way, it really does increase student on-task behavior. The constant interaction of I do something, you do something increases that on-task behavior. What students are talking about and what they are thinking about is what they're learning about. So when they have to do something every few seconds, it doesn't allow for their minds to wander and for them to get off track. One of my favorite Archerisms by Anita Archer is avoid the void for they will fill it, right? So constantly asking them to participate. Next, as students have more and more opportunities to practice, the number of errors begins to decrease. And the more opportunities we have as educators to provide that praise and that positive feedback, which we know is so motivating for students. The practice and feedback loop and the small incremental steps make learning visible for students. They know exactly what they need to do, they know how to do it, and they have the just-in-time feedback to ensure it. Makes that learning visible. All of these things together lead to the ultimate goal of increased academic success and learning outcomes for students. So this is the how of opportunities to respond. It's a really quick and easy 3-step process. The teacher provides a task or a question and a prompt or a cue. Then the student responds, and then the teacher provides immediate feedback, either positive praise or corrective. And that's the loop. It continues with another task, another signal, another response, another opportunity for feedback. When we think about the types of responses that can be happening, there are many different types of responses, and they all are better suited for different situations. So we're going to talk a little bit about them. So the first kind of response is the choral response. And this is most appropriate for prompts where the response is short and everyone is likely to say the same thing. It's not really useful for longer responses or things where students might say different things. So when we think about choral responses and foundational skills or phonics instruction, word reading instruction, choral responses are ideal. In addition to short responses where there's one correct answer, choral responses can be used for things such as choral reading of longer sentences or passages, or for cloze activities where students have to fill in a blank or only read a bolded word. Now, partner responses can be used for longer responses or when the answers will vary by students. For example, if you ask students to finish a sentence stem. In these situations, the teacher can still keep control of the pacing and the exchange by assigning partner 1, partner 2, and directing who talks first and giving only enough time for students to have to respond to the prompt that was given, and then directing them to switch. Individual responses or cold calling is best used sparingly and reserved for small groups when giving individual turns to check in on individual skill acquisition is desirable. Written responses can be used in a variety of situations, such as in preparation for sharing. So before I do a think pair or a partner response, I might give students a time to jot something down. Brain drains when activating prior knowledge, or after a lesson as a ticket out the door where students are asked to write everything that they can remember, or a stop and jot for use throughout a lesson. Finally, there's nonverbal or physical responses. Nonverbal response can be used to show agreement or disagreement, thumbs up or thumbs down, a number of fingers to indicate a multiple choice answer, or it can be more active, stand up if, sit down if, or a four corners activity where students move to a designated spot. So those are the different kinds of responses. Choral responses will give us our biggest bang for our buck, so to speak, especially with this foundational skills instruction in either whole group or in small group scenarios. What you'll notice is another one of my favorite archerisms: everyone does everything. Choral responses ensure that everybody has an opportunity to think and respond. This really increases every student's opportunities. So let's consider hand raising versus whole group responses. In a 30-minute lesson where students are asked, who knows this? Raise your hand if you know, and they share an answer. Maybe in a 30-minute lesson, if we're lucky, every student has 1 or 2 times to answer. Over 180 school days, that would be 270 responses per student. Now consider a 30-minute lesson with whole group responses where every child responds to every prompt. 22 responses, let's say, in a 30-minute lesson, 3,700 responses per student across 180 school days, maximizing the learning. So when we talk about choral responses, because that is what we are going to be focusing in on, it's really important to think about how to cue for those choral responses. Cueing is important for so many reasons, and most importantly, because as an educator, it allows you to control the think time and provide equitable responses. When everybody has the amount of time that they need to think about the response, and then we cue them for the response, then everybody has that opportunity to think and share. So we need to engage in the art of cueing. And so when we think about cues, there are 2 different kinds of cues used in 2 completely different scenarios. So first of all, there's visual cues. And we use these visual cues when students are looking at the teacher or at a shared stimulus. Maybe I have a board, maybe I have slides, maybe we're looking up at a text together. So when the students are looking at the teacher or at a shared stimulus, we can use visual cues because the students can see the teacher. And so visual cues can be something like pointing, it can be scooping, it can be a strike through, it can be hand signals like wait or a hand drop to indicate it's time for them to respond. So any of these kind of visual cues can be used to control the wait time and have students respond chorally altogether. The next kind of response is an auditory response or an auditory cue. So this is really important when we shift our instruction and students now are looking down at their own copy of a stimulus, like a word grid or a text. They're no longer looking up at you, so a visual cue is no longer going to be effective. So at this point, we want to use an auditory cue. Sometimes that auditory cue is a verbal command. Sometimes it's a sharp tap with a marker on the table. Sometimes it's a snap. So these auditory cues are meant for when the student is not looking at you, but they hear your cue and they know what to do next. Cueing can feel really unnatural, but it is imperative for the success of choral responding. Good cueing allows the teacher to control the pacing, control the think time, and ensure that all students are responsible for their own thinking and their own responding. These are things, choral responses, all these types of responses and cues can be used in whole group and in small group. But when we think about tier 2 and tier 3 instruction, there are some common pitfalls that can happen. So we as humans are creatures of habit, and habits are hard to change. So the first thing we can do is be aware and notice them when they're happening. So the first pitfall is reverting to asking students to raise their hands or to respond as individual responses. A key here is if you find yourself asking who knows questions, then that's what you're asking for, is students to raise a hand or to individually respond. And that is a killer for choral responses. Another pitfall is too much teacher talk. And I find that when you're in a small group scenario, you can find yourself over explaining a task. You can find yourself going off track and using something happened and it's a new teachable moment. So you get yourself off track to use that teachable moment to teach something else. And sometimes our students have this really, really great knack for getting us to engage in unrelated conversation. And this pitfall will also be a destroyer of the opportunities to respond. And finally, the last pitfall for small group instruction and choral responding is not providing that immediate feedback. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about that feedback. First, we're going to talk about immediate corrective feedback. In small groups, it's really a lot easier for us as educators to listen for those errors than it is in whole group. So during this precious small group time, that is our job as educators, to be extra attentive and extra vigilant to ensure errors are corrected every single time. Preventing errors from becoming habits. When we error correct and model correct responses, then it speeds up student skill acquisition and it clarifies expectations right away. We want to stay on top of that. Every error gets a corrective feedback. Then we have affirmative feedback. So affirmative positive feedback we know is motivating for students, and students thrive on praise. They love to know that they're doing something well. So by providing specific praise, whether it be on effort, strategy, or improvement, we are building that motivation for learning. Again, we are highlighting correct behaviors and we're encouraging repetition of successful actions. So next, we're going to go into a primary example of maybe a tier 2 focused lesson. And before we get into it, we're going to go back to alignment and that idea that alignment remains the first priority. We want our interventions to be aligned to two different aspects. We want alignment to the tier 1 instruction that's happening in the classroom, and we also want to ensure alignment to assessment data and student needs. So let's take a look at this scenario. So imagine now you're teaching grade 1, and let's imagine that you're using tier 1 or UFly as your tier 1 phonics explicit instruction program. Ideally, this time of year, you're going to be somewhere around lesson 84, for which the new concept is AYAI, spells A. And you also have a small group of students with similar profiles on their middle of year screening that looks like this. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Acadience and the ALO dashboard, what you're looking at is a middle of year profile. In the first column, you see the reading composite score that indicates the student is in need of intensive support, score falling in the red. The next two scores are the nonsense word fluency scores. So you can see the yellow score indicates their correct letter sounds. So the student is approaching the benchmark for their correct letter sounds. So probably knows their letter sounds fairly decently, approaching that benchmark. The next score, where we see it's sitting at a 1 in the red, that is the whole words read score. The next two scores are aligned to the student's oral reading fluency of connected text, so the ORF score, and we can see that the student is still in that intensive support range. So moving on, last time we talked about the importance of analyzing response patterns. So the scores tell us if a student is at risk, but the response patterns indicate why and what specific skills need intervention. So thinking back to this student, going back to the student's, next slide, please. Yep, there we go. So there's our benchmark scores, but here looking at that critical first nonsense word fluency assessment, here are our response patterns. And when I look at these response patterns, I see some really great things happening. I see that this student has some evidence of whole word reading. So I see ut, I see zos, I see iv, one time only. So I see some really good positives there. I also see a lot of sound, recode, sound, recode. So that is showing me that the student is on that cusp of whole word reading. I also see some opportunities here, and I see some areas where we've got some vowel confusions. So I know that's something that I'm going to have to pay attention to in my instruction. Okay, so that's alignment to student needs, right? So, oh, sorry, so instructional next steps for the student were the primary next step was whole word reading, and the secondary step would be reading that connected text, because we know we are in the middle of the year and we do have to move that student past whole word reading and into text reading as well. So then we think about alignment to tier 1. So we're on lesson 84. We know we're into those vowel teams and even some 2-syllable words. But what we're trying to get this student to do is way back. If we were to think about it, we might have to go way back to lesson 35. So how do we align our tier 2 instruction to student needs and to tier 1 instruction? Well, we think about that continuum and all of the lessons in between. And when we think about that, the skill of reading whole words, what does that progression look like from where we're starting to where we need to get to? And so we know that we're going to plan for our instruction to follow that same continuum or that same scope and sequence. So again, when we think about this student or this group of students, their primary instructional priority is that whole word reading. We really need to get going with that. The student is on the cusp. We saw that in their response patterns. So what we really need to be focusing on is that careful removal of scaffolds, and quickly. We want the student to be doing the bulk of the work and us as the educator providing as minimum scaffolds and support as necessary. The secondary instructional priority is that reading connected text. And we saw from the scores that the student is far from that goal. So when we get to instruction that is in that connected text, we know that we're going to need to highly support it in our small group practice times. So then we start to develop and plan for our tier 2 literacy intervention. I'm going to focus on blending for word reading. I'm going to make it UFly aligned. I'm going to use the same skills, the same strategies, the same language that I use in my tier 1 in my tier 2. And I'm going to focus in on trying to get as many opportunities to respond for my students. So the objectives in my tier 2 programming, students will be able to blend phonemes to read words. We're going to start at the CVC and digraph word level. So those CCVC and CVCC words. So we're going to go jump right into both. And then we're going to progress. Soon as I see students are picking it up, then we're going to progress to the more complex spelling patterns. And eventually we're going to, if we can get there, progress to those 2-syllable words. The key features of my program will be that explicit modeling, high opportunities to respond. I'm going to plan for my immediate correction, and I'm going to try to keep that perky pace, that fast pace of instruction. When I look at this lesson structure, I want to spend most of my students' time in that practice, in that guided and independent practice. But I do have to provide some time for a warm-up, some minds-on, some getting ready. I do want to provide some time for modeling, and then I'm going to get into that guided, independent, and fluency stages. So then we're going to get into a little demonstration, but I want to set up the demo before we get started. First and foremost, in a virtual environment like this, there's a very big difference from what I would do in person to what I can demonstrate in a virtual environment. So I'm going to give you an overview of the cues I'll be using with my students today, and my students today will be Una. And because we are in this virtual environment, I'll be using a visual cue that is built into my slides. You're going to see red dots and red arrows. Those will serve as my visual cues. If I were in person with a group, I likely would not be using a slide deck with students. I would use a different visual cue, like pointing with my finger and scooping from sound to sound. But in this situation, we will be using red dots and red arrows. In either situation, a visual cue is appropriate because I'm asking students to look at a shared stimulus. In this case, we're going to do our guided portion with the slide. Later in the lesson, you're going to see a visual grid of words. during the independent practice portion. At this time of the lesson, I will be cueing Una to put her finger under the first word, which means I'm assuming that she is now looking at her own page. At this point, she's no longer looking at me and a shared visual stimulus, so a visual cue would no longer be effective, and I would need to move to an auditory cue. Again, being online makes taps or snaps very difficult to hear, so I will be cueing using my voice, and I will tell her my cues will be blend it, read it. And those will be my auditory cues for her. Okay. So having said that, I think I'm going to take over the sharing of our screen.
You
Oh,
should be
it's
good.
ready for me already.
I just hope I'm ready for you for the demo. I hope I.
I hope so. I'm nervous about the screen sharing. You know how I get.
You
Okay.
got it.
So I'm going to get myself into slideshow mode.
Let's go.
So this I'm going to set up. So I'm going to do the modeling first. We are going to be practicing 2 different techniques today in our mini lesson, and it's really all focused on blending to read. So I'm going to model first. Take a look, watch me. Take a look at this first word. I'm going to blend the sounds slowly as I say the sounds, and then I'm going to read the word. Wish. Now I'm going to read it, wish. Take a look at this next word. On this next word, I see that it begins with a stop sound. When I see a stop sound, I'm going to blend right into the vowel. Watch me. Top, top. So that is the technique that I'm going to be looking for Una to be practicing with me today. This is where I need some audience participation and a little bit of help from you folks at home. Hopefully you're at home. If you're driving or listening or doing something else, please don't do this part. Just follow along and be safe. But if you're at home and you have a pen and a piece of paper handy, what I would like you to do is grab that now and create yourself a T-chart. On one side of the T-chart, you are going to write the title OTRs, Opportunities to Respond. And on this side, all you're going to be doing is using tally marks to record how many opportunities Una has to read a word, including during corrective feedback. So every time she has an opportunity to sound out and read a word, make a tally mark. Okay, so that's one side of your T-chart. On your other side of your T-chart, you can just call it feedback. And I want you to see if you can listen for and record 2 different forms of feedback. And what did they sound like? What were the characteristics of that feedback? And we will talk about that. We will debrief after. Okay, so everybody is setting up their T-charts, ready to go. One side, it's just tally marks, and then the other side, any notes that you want to take about the feedback given. All right, Una, welcome to our guided practice. Participants, watch and listen for error correction and count the OTRs. Okay, so Una, we're going to do things a little bit differently today, okay? I am going to cue you only with the visual cues that we've been practicing. So you're going to look for those red dots and arrows. And today I'm going to shut my voice off so I can really hear you practice. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's take a look at this first word. Remember, hold your sounds until you see the next dot appear. Are you ready to blend it?
I'm ready.
All right, blend it.
Map.
Read it.
Map.
Excellent. Take a look at the next word. Blend it.
Ed.
That's good blending, Una, but watch me. We're going to try that again. I see a stop sound at the beginning, so I'm going to blend into the vowel. Ready? Watch me. Bed. Now I'll read it. Bed. I want you to try that. Don't forget, blend into the vowel. Ready?
Yep. Bed.
Read it.
Bed.
Let's try that one more time.
Bed. Bed.
I love how you blended into that vowel. Good work. Next word, blend it.
Ship.
Read it.
Ship.
Excellent job. All right. Una, here's your word grid in front of you now. I want you to put your finger on the first word. So now we're transitioning to those auditory cues. So for this first row, Una, what I want you to do, I want you to blend it, and then you're going to read it. I'm going to cue you to blend, and then I will cue you to read. Are you ready?
Ready.
Blend it.
Fish.
Read it.
Fish.
Next word. Before you go, I see a stop sound. Do you see it?
I see it.
What are you going to do?
I'm going to blend into the vowel.
Beautiful. Go for it.
Tap.
Read it.
Tap.
Excellent. Next word. Blend it.
Mad.
Read it.
Mad.
Excellent. We're going to change things up a little, Una. Next line, what I want you to do is when I cue you to blend it, I want you to blend in your head. And then I'm going to cue you to read it. And then I want you to just read it. Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay. Blend it. Read it.
Pet.
Blend it. Read it.
Shop.
Watch me. Take a look at this vowel. The vowel says eh. What sound?
Eh.
Watch me blend it. Ship. Watch me read it. Ship. Your turn. Blend it.
Ship.
Read it.
Ship.
Blend it again.
Out loud.
Yes, please.
Ship.
Read it.
Ship.
That's right. Ship. Ship. Next word. Blend it.
Big.
Sorry, blend it in your head. We both forgot. Blend it in your head. Blend it. Read it.
Big.
Excellent. For this last line, Una, you take control. If you can read the word, just read it. If you need to sound it and blend, that's fine too. Go for it.
Chop. Lid. Let.
Let's do this one together. Watch me. The vowel says ah. What sound?
Ah.
I will blend it. Lot. You blend it.
Lot.
I'll blend it again. Lot. Now I'll read it. Lot. Your turn. Blend it and read it.
Lot. Lot.
Read it. Excellent. Good job, Una. All right. Whew.
I know.
That was intense.
It's hard doing it online when the timing is a bit wacky.
Absolutely. You did great. You did a great job.
So did you.
Okay. High five, team. Okay. So we are now I'm going to go back to I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to go back to the audience and open up the chat. I would love for you to count up your tally marks right now and think about how many opportunities did Una have to respond during that time. Do we see any responses? If everybody's 29, 28, 29, 27, 28, 18 to 20 opportunities to respond. Lost track at 25. Absolutely. So Una, did you want to start sharing again, or is it going back to me?
Nope.
It's back
There
to
we
you.
go. Should be good.
So when you think about the time, we had said that that took about 2 minutes to do that guided and that independent practice, maybe 2.5, maybe 3 minutes. But when we think back to what the structure should have looked like, we were looking for a 10-minute chunk of time for that guided and independent. So multiply all of those responses by 4 or 5, and that's how many opportunities Una has to practice with that immediate corrective feedback and praise feedback. So I hope you were able to hear both kinds of feedback, and we are going to come back to feedback in just a little while. So let me see, give me a sec. Where am I here? All right, so we are going to now shift a little bit to our older students, and we're going to talk about tier 3 interventions. So when we're looking at supporting our older striving readers, we often turn to those evidence-based, research-based tier 3 scripted programs that Una was talking about. And Una told us about the importance of looking for those programs that have some good research and evidence behind their efficacy. The good news is when you find that good evidence-based program, these tier 3 interventions have our opportunities to respond built right in for us. And our job becomes more about implementation and fidelity and less about planning. The same goes for the corrective feedback. Most good intervention programs will provide coaching and scripts for error correction. So the hard work of planning is done for us. But then what are some of those potential barriers for tier 3? So, challenge number one. So, part of my role in my board is leading reading interventions, tier 3 reading interventions. And when I engage in PD or when I go for site visits or when I talk to educators, one of the biggest challenges that I hear is student participation. These kids don't want to do this. And my first caution is always beware of projection. Many times I hear that students don't want to be pulled out of class and they don't want to be centered out. And that very well may be the case. But before we jump to that conclusion, I want you to consider and think about why you believe that to be true and what bias you might be bringing to that thinking. Be careful not to project your own perceptions of what students think and or perceptions based on previous experiences. Don't use those previous experiences to talk about your current students and your current groups. You may be surprised at how much students welcome the opportunity to engage in small group, whether it's where their individual needs are being met and they have that opportunity to feel successful. The next thing to remember, especially for our older students, is cultivating those relationships is key. Taking some time to get to know the students, especially if you're in a position where you're not a classroom teacher, you're in a special education and a support role where you might not know all the students as well as others. So take the time to build those relationships as you're starting intervention. And the third thing is this is so critical to ensure that students are in it with you. And that sometimes is easier said than done. So the next thing we're going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about a concept that I'm still in the process of learning about, the relationship matrix. So the relationship matrix and intervention. The relationship matrix is a model, and it demonstrates how we coexist in relationship with others. It's a restorative practice approach that has us reflect on the dynamics of power in relationship. And this is crucial in education systems, which are by design hierarchical in nature. In this matrix comes from a book called The Little Book of Restorative Justice in Education by Evans and Vandering. And it talks about how in schools, people often experience or engage with power in unbalanced ways. Having said that, the book also concedes that power is not inherently bad or good, but how that power is used will impact the health of our relationships. What this model demonstrates is that there are a variety of situations where an imbalance occurs and a power over others relationship results. And that is demonstrated in people doing things to or for others. So we see those two quadrants, and Una, if you can, to or for others, and more profoundly, ignoring others completely. And that's that not quadrant. In an ideal relationship, a power with situation, so that gray box, is developed where support and expectations are provided in a balanced and reciprocal way. So as a theoretical model, this is very high level thinking for me. And so I often have to apply it to a context for it to become more clear. So I like to think about it. I like to use reading interventions as a way to think about relationship, or relationship as a way to think about students participating in intervention with us. So it's difficult for us to reflect on the not quadrant. So Una, if you can transition to the next one. There we go. So in the not quadrant, this is the quadrant where students are not selected for intervention. And it's a situation that we must think about each and every day if we are in a position where we are deciding who gets the limited resources of intervention. We know we cannot meet the needs of every student, but we have to be conscientious, even here, when we consider who is passed over and ensure that bias and privilege are not the factors driving these decisions. In the to quadrant, I start to reflect on the process for selection of groups that are driven by data. And this is ultimately what we want. We want to match students to appropriate interventions based on relevant and current data. We want cohesive groups, but when we make these decisions in a vacuum of data and neglect to think about the people involved as individuals with their own identities and stories, we can be enacting relationships where we hold the power over students to tell them what is best for them. In the lower right quadrant, we have the situation where we know a student needs something. They need something. And from a desire to give something, we may neglect the data altogether in favor of the mere presence of need. Think about, have you ever included a student in a group because they needed something, even if that intervention you were providing isn't the right something that they need, but at least they're getting something. So instead, what we want to do is we want to aim for the top right quadrant, where students are selected based on their need and their data, and they are honored as individuals and consulted and invited to share in the power dynamics with us. Where there's a choice for participation, where they feel seen and supported in making the decision to come along with us on this journey of intervention. We do this when we present students and their families with the option to participate. We are upfront about the why and the what and what the expectations are, and how we, as the interventionists, will provide the support for their success. When we engage them in what's important to them and what their goals are, and our older students, the older they are, the more capable they are of fully engaging and being active participants, and not an object to be managed in small group or simply an object of need. So this is a newer concept to me, but it's something that was shared with me in my board, and it just resonates with me. And I hope some of it resonates with you as well, because really overcoming that first challenge of students not wanting to come to intervention is really the biggest challenge. And if we can understand this matrix and start to look at participation in this way, I think we can overcome that challenge. So next, we're going to look at challenge number 2. So even when students are afforded agency in their learning and are willing and active participants who want to join us, there are going to be parts of the journey that will not feel natural for them, which brings us to challenge number 2, and the one instructional move that maximizes OTRs, choral responses. The fact of the matter is, they won't want to, and you won't want to make them, but you must. So this is something that we address head on with educators, especially ones that are new to teaching in scripted programs. They won't want to do it. The older they are, they're not used to this method of choral responding. They're used to our system and our habits of raise your hand to respond. And these are likely the students who don't raise their hand to respond. So they won't want to, and you won't want to make them. So it is critical to set those expectations at the outset and practice until they know that you're not going to let it go. Remember, another archerism, learning is not a spectator sport. Everybody does everything. So one way to overcome this challenge is to engage in a practice of creating shared agreements. So we always recommend spending time early in the intervention, getting to know those students, building some shared agreements with them. Talk about what the intervention should look like and feel like, and what each of them can offer and bring to the group. Whatever the agreements are made, it's critical that you also include whatever expectations you as the educator need students to adhere to. These are shared agreements for how we coexist in this relationship together. Their needs, our needs. This is where the expectations for choral responding and reading can be built in. Okay, finally, challenge number 3. The third and final challenge is feedback. There are a few critical errors that educators can and do make. And the first one is making the assumption that students know it, they just made a little mistake. And that leads to our second error and making them repeat errors. So phrases like, let's try that again, or you know this one, try it again, can sometimes lead to a correction, but it often leads to students practicing the error they made in the first place. So we want to avoid those phrases of let's try it again. Come on, guys, you know this one. So we want to avoid that. And the last challenge or the last error is not using the scripts that are provided. Well, in these tier 3 programs, the scripts are there and they're provided for you. But the problem with errors and error correction scripts is they never appear exactly where you need them. A script cannot anticipate where a human student will make the error. So the key is to be prepared, find these error correction prompts and practice them. They're often not in the main body of the script, but more likely in the margins or in a box off to the side or the bottom of the page. Find them and practice them. So again, look for those sample scripts of error correction, and couple do's and don'ts here. So do use your scripts every single time. Or if you're like me and sometimes you can't find them fast enough, default to these steps. So anytime an error is made and you can't find your prompt or your script, you can default to modeling the correct response, having the students repeat the correct response 2 times, and then affirm yes, and then again repeat the correct response. This correction procedure allows students to hear the correct response and engage with the correct response 4 times. Once when I model it, 2 times when they practice it, and another time when I affirm yes and say the correct response again. So that is a default error correction that I often will use when I can't find my scripts in a timely manner. So model, repeat, repeat, yes, affirm, response. And a couple of do nots. Do not allow mistakes to go uncorrected. Every single time, make that correction. Don't ask for them to try it again. Just default to model the correct response, have them repeat it. And in a group scenario, today when we did our modeling, Una was my sole student, one student, but that's not likely going to be the case. You're going to have a group of students in front of you. It is very unnecessary for you to point out individual errors or call students out. In a group situation, everyone does everything. So anytime you hear an error, no matter who did it, you just fall into your error correction and just say, let's stop, let's try that, watch me, and then you proceed. So nobody needs to be called out on their errors. So we're going to take a look at the next slide, and this is just a brief excerpt from a multisyllabic decoding intervention that I use with older students. And the prompt here is part, 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 word. So Una is going to be my student yet again. So take a look at this first word, Una. What is the first part?
Pro.
What is the next part?
Hab.
So I hear an error and I'm going to fall into my correction procedure. The parts are pro. What part?
Pro.
The next part is hib. What part?
Hib.
Next part, it. What part?
It.
Say them again.
Pro. Hib. It.
The word is prohibit. What word?
Prohibit.
Yes, prohibit, prohibit. So you can see that I fell into that same correction procedure. She repeated it twice. I modeled, repeat, repeat, and then affirm. So essentially, use your scripts, but if you can't find them easily, you can always default to that type of responding. So that's it for me. In summary, when we have a limited amount of, we can't modify the time, we can't modify the group size, we can't increase the number of sessions, we can maximize OTRs in other ways. And that is often in the explicitness of our teaching, in our preparedness of teaching, and in our fidelity of implementation of our Tier 3 programs. Really setting expectations and holding students accountable to those expectations is super important. Choral responding is your friend. They won't want to, and you won't want to make them, but it's the best way to maximize those OTRs. Quick pacing, and don't ever forget about the error correction, feedback, and practice. Now back over to you, Una.
Well, thanks, Ines, for number one, sharing your insights and also being a brilliantly delightful teacher. So thank you for that. Just as we look at our time, I'm mindful of everybody's time as we wrap up. I do just want to, again, build out some context for this of recognizing the incredible importance of thinking about reading intervention, but thinking about how we're doing reading intervention. You'll see the OHRC really highlights that reading intervention, when done well, which means early in timing, evidence-based in terms of the effectiveness, implemented, closely monitored, they are so effective in reducing reading failure and meeting students' right to learn to read. So it's why we are so keenly excited to dig into our last session, where we will revisit the taxonomy of intensification again. We will see you on Monday, April 20th. Wow. At 7 p.m. In the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions we can support you with. Thanks so much to everybody for joining us. We really appreciate your time this evening, and hope you're having a wonderful week.